I say this every year. It's just been an absolute privilege and honor, really, to be their teacher, the readers today, my students. I feel it's they who teach me. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, I hope I can be a good. I hope I'm a good encouragement for them, and to get people just to kind of express what they want to express. And I think we do that. We do that really well in the class. But they really teach me so much about life and so much about the importance of writing and how important it is to write in order to and to face the truth and to always be as true and honest as possible. They totally inspire me. Every time I leave the classroom, I feel like doing nothing else but writing. I just go home and write, and I just, their amazing wisdom and the passion they put into every word they write is just, it's otherworldly. It transcends any so-called normal classroom that anybody might be part of. It's a wonderful experience. I'm always reminded of a different poem every year. I just wanted to give some credit to Ellen Prescott, who's always our first reader. And Ellen, you've been taking this class with me for 50, 60 years now, I think. Yeah, I think something like that. Yeah. Anyway, this is Ellen's little painting on what I call it, a painting. On the front cover are the two swans, and also it was the title of Rainbow Bridge of Light, Voices from the Universe, was taken from one of her poems, which is inscribed inside the program. The longest distance between 2 points is a rainbow bridge of color, a rainbow bridge of light when all will come together in hand and dance in the circle of light. Our universe ties us together. We're one as the moon, as the sun, as a raindrop, as a snowflake, as a grain of sand, as a leaf, as a flower. We are one. And so I thought that was a really beautiful sentiment that kind of expresses who we are and what our group is all about. The other poet I thought of this year was Emily Dickinson, and her idea about the vital light. And I think of my group as a light, the rainbow bridge of light, and I think of them as kind of the light of the world, and how key that word, that image really is. And Emily Dickinson had written about the role of the poet. The poet's light but lamps themselves go out, the wicks they stimulate, if vital light, in here as do the suns, each age a lens, disseminating their circumference. And so it's that idea that these poets, my students, the readers today, are that vital light that endures, that keeps poetry, that keeps writing permanent in the world from generation to generation. I think that's the beauty of the whole thing. That life might be temporary, that we ourselves, may not be here forever, but what we do and what we write about will always be here, will always endure, will always be passed on to the generations. And anyway, on that note, I would like to begin. Our first reader today will be, as I said, Ellen Prescott. Each reader will be coming up here and introducing themselves, okay? And since Ellen's our first reader, I'll be introducing her. Anyway, let her words speak for themselves. And thank you.
Mitch Levenberg, Professor, you are the best. From your patient listening, establishing a facilitating class environment, to your thoughtful written review of my submitted work, to your encouragement and natural kindness, and above all, to your sense of humor, imaginative prompts which spark my sense of whimsy, play, and fantasy, to raising my writer's voice and consciousness, to the writer I am, to the writer I want to be. You are my muse's muse, and I thank you very much. The prompt I used in my story, which I've entitled A Lionized Lion for All Seasons, begins my story. This is the prompt. Quote, as soon as he entered the lion's cage, he realized he had forgotten something very important, unquote. What he thought could never happen did. It was too late. Philip was in, and the cage door was slammed shut behind him. He forgot his whip, and there was no chair in the cage, which he used as a prop too, in working with his lion, because the cage had been cleaned earlier in the day, and the chair was not returned as it should have been. The security guard was well on his way to another site and could not hear Philip's call. He would have to wait until the security guard returned to let him out. It was the end of the day, and Philip relied on the guards returning shortly, as he always did, checking everything before closing time. Philip thought, be calm, show no fear, and don't cower, as he moved slowly and consciously. Any quick, unsettled movement would disturb and possibly provoke the lion. Alone and unprotected, it was just him and Henry VIII. A suitable name, Philip thought, because Henry would be a lion king and prove to have a voracious appetite over the years, loving the large, chunky servings of raw meat, which he could easily tear apart after the first 2 bites. And here he was, Philip d'Estienne, a well-respected member of a well-known family of printers and booksellers, despite his family's consternation, a circus lion tamer. A chosen profession as far back as he could remember, from the first time he was taken as a boy to the circus to see especially the lions, which fascinated him. Philip had rescued Henry when he purchased the lion as an abused and neglected cub from very willing to sell traders, paying a very high price for him. Henry had just arrived from his native country in the rocky sub-Saharan of Africa. At first sight, Philip fell in love with the cub, caring for him while patiently, affectionately training the lion for the circus life as a performer. Philip never used his whip on Henry. It was the sound of it that communicated the moves Philip wanted from the lion, who proved to be unusually intelligent, and indeed, his act became the most popular one in France. Philip was known as the greatest lion tamer ever of the Cirque de Paris. And as the seasons passed, Henry grew to become a most magnificent, regal, beautifully striking lion, with a shiny golden light brown coat, a full lovely mane of hair finished in a dark brown, and a slender, agile, muscular body, particularly noticeable when on the prowl, with the lithesome gracefulness and strength peculiar to his species. Philip was relieved that Henry had eaten his meal and unusually napped afterwards, as he watched the lion playfully pawing at the meat scraps left over. And when Henry was no longer interested in the meat scraps, he yawned, blinking his eyes, lied down while he scrutinized Philip as he rested his chin on one of his paws, suggesting a willingly harmless acknowledgement in sharing his territory. Ah, so you trust me, my pet, my Henry, Philip said softly. But did he truly trust his trainer? Philip wondered, continuing to speak softly as he stood as far back as the cage permitted, looking at Henry, whispering, "There's a good man. Yes, you know me well. It's been a long time since you were a little one, and I'm your friend, you know that. Good man." All the while, Philip was thinking, I'm no longer in control. I'm at his mercy. It is Henry who was controlling him. Would this be a battle of wits and will? Surely Philip knew what the outcome would be if he lost, but he hoped, was counting on the young lion repaying his kindness. Here would be the test, as he felt a cold sweat taking charge of his entire body. How could he have been so careless to let this happen? As he glanced his wristwatch, he knew too that the animal could sense, smell his fear. "Good fellow," Philip continued whispering. "We won't work today. This is more or less just a very friendly visit." Fortunately, Philip did have in his pants pocket some candy of sweet meat ground with sugar in cube form, made as a treat for lions, which he used in training. Knowing how Henry loved the candy, Philip slid several cubes across the cage to him. As the lion let out a roar, Philip thought, "So far, so good. He's thanking me." "Now, my good man," Philip said, "I see you are sleepy and want to relax, so we can engage, n'est-ce pas, in conversation until you fall asleep. You know that you are very special to me, Henry, and I love you, and there is a mutual bondship between us. I believe this is the case, yes, right, my good man?" As Philip spoke, the lion got up, slowly moving stealthily towards Philip. His eyes were intensely beset upon Philip. "Dear God," Philip thought, "he looks like an oversized kitten who just spotted his prey. Let us hope not. Please, God." While Philip stood still with apprehension, Henry moved as close to Philip as possible. Now, not far from the cage was a large carousel, which was playing a very old tune for the last time before closing. Perhaps a Sigmund Romberg tune, Philip was not sure, but it went something like this. "Let me call you sweetheart, I'm in love with you. Let me hear you whisper that you love me too." As Henry was staring at Philip, his eyes shone amber-colored as the daylight dimmed, but they were not menacing. They were, Philip felt, trusting, and he further observed something he never had seen from the grown Henry before. It was a curiosity, an understanding being demonstrated by the lion. It was a very special softness, as Henry tilted his head to one side, listening while Philip sang. Philip, encouraged, remembered the lyrics as his mother had sang them to him when he was a child, singing, "Keep the love light glowing in your beautiful eyes of blue. Let me hear you whisper that you love me too." And suddenly Henry stood up on his hind legs, putting his front paws on either side of Philip's shoulder. Philip thought, "Let me die like a man now. Let it be quick," bracing himself literally for what he thought was next to happen, as he simultaneously pictured saying goodbye to his beloved wife Claudette and their little daughter Babette. But the lion began to lick Philip's face, and although his breath was difficult to take, Philip cried from relief, thank you, my good friend." Then Henry tamely pushed him as the carousel's music played on, and Philip, responding to his gentle touch, said, "What is this? You want to dance, Henry?" So Philip followed the lion's lead, waltzing with him around the cage, and around they danced. Philip thinking, "This is incredible. Pity there is no one to see this. A lion waltzing with a man?" And who would believe this ever happening, or ever happening again? Philip was elated, and after the music stopped, Henry let Philip go, and Philip couldn't resist patting the lion, whispering affectionately while the lion responded. It was evening. The stars were shining brightly, and by this time, Philip was exhausted from the strain as he saw the security guard come running towards the cage with a pointed gun. The lion intuitively retreated to the back of the cage. "Mon Dieu! Mon Dieu!" the guard exclaimed. "You've been in the cage so long by yourself with that beast? I am so sorry." "Yes, I have," Philip smiled. "Are you all right, monsieur?" "Yes, I am. Very all right," Philip said. "And you can put away your gun, sir. He has no intention of harming me." "Very good, monsieur," the guard replied. And Philip smilingly added, "He is like a big loving kitten," as he exited the cage. "I am glad to see that," the guard replied, "and I did not have to shoot him." "Life is precious." "Yes," Philip said, "it is." As this was happening, Henry let out a lion-sized roar, the cry of which was to both Philip and the guard very alarming. Then Henry, running towards the front of the cage, closest to where Philip and the guard were standing, dropped to the floor of the cage, pressing his body against the locked cage door. Philip and Henry's eyes met, and Philip couldn't help responding to what he believed was Henry's sadness, which was so humanly reflected upon his face that it was undeniably profound. And Philip gasped in disbelief when he saw tears running down from the lion's eyes upon his face. "Dear friend," Philip said, "don't cry. You must continue to believe in me. Be brave. Take heart, my lion-hearted friend. You are my truest ally, as I am yours." And Henry, standing up on all fours, as if he meant to tenderly touch Philip's face, raised his right paw and pressed it against the bars of the cage. Philip was so moved by this gesture, he too had tears in his eyes, touching the gated lion's paw with his hand. "Goodbye for now, my friend," Philip said. "I will be back tomorrow, I promise, and I will arrange to free you from this cruel life of captivity, this jail, this hell, this prison life. You will live in a natural habitat, which you deserve, I promise." Then Henry looked up through the cage's roof and stared fixatedly at the stars and roared as only a lion king could roar from the crest of a mountain hill. Love, as well as loneliness, are conditions affecting both man and animal. Philip learned from Henry how deeply they could be felt. Philip never did train another lion again.
I'm Alice Delury, and before I read my piece, I want to tell you about the St. Francis Writers Group, of which I've been a member for about 5 years. The arrival of a new member invariably follows a pattern. After introducing him or herself, the person sits silent, as far back in the room as the back wall will allow, and attempts to appear invisible. Then, 2 weeks into the term, the new member will shyly and apologetically ask to present something, much in the way of a cat laying a dead mouse at Mitch's feet. It will usually be the smallest jumbled thought or observation written on a scrap of paper or in the back of a battered notebook. This performance will be repeated once or twice more, and then mirabile dictu, a whole and entire essay from them. And what a release it has been for us all to finally get it out, to turn the yearning to write about something into a reality on paper. And we are all the richer for hearing others' stories, stories that would be lost to us if it had not been for this group and Mitch's benevolent and encouraging presence. You didn't know you were benevolent, did you?
No, I didn't.
Anyway, this piece is called The Turkish Baby. Dr. Salvatore Altchek had a medical practice in our neighborhood for 67 years until he died at age 92. His obituary in the New York Times had the headline, "The $5 doctor dies," because that was the fee he famously charged his poor patients. He came from a family of Sephardic Jewish ancestry, a large number of them medical doctors in every conceivable specialty, many of them practicing in New York City. My Dr. Altchek may have had a specialty, but I don't know what it was. He seemed to be good at dealing with most of the medical problems his patients presented with. If he was stumped, he always referred you to some colleague, expert at what he thought you might have. He clearly was a legend in the field, and it was not rare for the second doctor to exclaim in amazement, "Dr. Altchek referred you? Is he still alive? Is he still practicing?" Yes to both questions. His office was almost a MASH battlefield dressing station. In the years when the docks, where the shipping industry was in full swing down the street from where I live, it was a common sight for two buddies of an injured longshoreman to haul him up the hill towards the doctor's office, the victim's head or leg swaddled in bloody wrappings. Dr. Altchek's office was in a brownstone building he owned. The front door opened into a dark, high-ceilinged waiting room. It had clearly not been redecorated in a half-century. It was filled with mix-match assortment of chairs upholstered in forest green or maroon mahogany, Norgahide. Nor had the issues of the tattered magazines been noticeably updated. That room was separated from the next by high sliding doors through which the doctor's elderly secretary would at intervals poke her head and call the next patient's name. The second room had a desk and file cabinets, and it was where the doctor took one's history. The problem was that Dr. Altchek was quite deaf and asked in a shout such personal questions as, "Do you have burning urine?" or "Do you have lumps in your breasts?" When I tried whispering my replies in the vain hope of bringing his voice down a few decibels, he would ask me in a louder voice to repeat myself. Easily embarrassed as I always have been, I could picture the ears of the occupants of the entire waiting room pricked up into points like Yule Brynner's, poised to hear my replies. Thankfully, the examining room was at the back of the house, and the goings-on there could not be heard in the waiting room. When it comes to a bedside manner, it must be said that Dr. Altchek had none. A young professional singer whose trills and scales purled out of the nearby window delighted me each morning, asked me for the doctor's name as she was new to the neighborhood. I recommended Dr. Altchek. On seeing him, she told me that at a quick look at her sore throat, he suggested in parting that she lose some weight. He himself was a bony starling of a man in horn-rimmed glasses whose three-piece suits hung in folds always. A rosy-cheeked, attractively plump young thing, she protested that she was an opera singer, and she needed those few spare pounds in the bosom area to provide a sounding board for her voice. On another occasion, a neighbor's elderly brother on a visit from Germany consulted him about his nervousness, insomnia, and arthritis pain. The man apparently was accustomed to the generous prescribing habits of doctors in his country. Dr. Olchek refused his requests outright for any and all medications, thus, "You probably drink too much. You look like you haven't exercised in years, and you're on your way to becoming a drug addict." He then practically threw him out of the office. He was the perfect go-to doctor, though, in an emergency. On my way to an exhibition at an auction gallery some years back, I bolted down a sandwich en route because I hadn't eaten in hours. I no sooner got to the gallery when I was hit with a spear-like pain in my sternum. My first thought was that I was having a heart attack. I called Dr. Olchek from a public phone, and he asked me a few questions. Satisfied that the pain was probably not a coronary, he told me to come to his office and, if possible, to pick up some antacid mints en route. When I got there, he peered at me, as was his usual custom, listened to my heart, folded his stethoscope, and said, "Your heart rate is normal, you're not sweating, and your color is good. You've got a case of gastritis. Take a couple of Advil for the pain and continue taking Tums. Eat lightly for the next day." That evening he called to see how I was doing. Thanks to him, I was fine and was spared a lot of anxiety. My favorite story of his highlights the practical way babies could be adopted in those days. You had a baby you couldn't or wouldn't keep, and there was a loving family who could or would keep the baby. A phone call and a little paperwork, and it was a done deal. The tale went thus. During World War II, Dr. Olchek got a call urging him to come to a certain house in Brooklyn where a woman was in serious condition. The caller would not elaborate, saying that she was in no shape to come to his office. He cabbed over and found the patient in the last stages of labor. He rolled up his sleeves and delivered the baby. Emerging from the bedroom, he went up to her soldier husband and said, "Congratulations, you have a beautiful baby boy." "See that?" the unsmiling soldier said, indicating a large olive canvas duffel bag inside the front door. "I just got back from 2 years overseas. That kid isn't mine," he growled, adding, "I am no stranger to killing, and I'll kill them both if you don't get that kid out of here now." Thinking quickly, Dr. Olchek called his office and told his secretary to grab a big tote he had there and to cab over to the address he gave her. He instructed her to keep the cab waiting at the curb. When she got there, he tucked the baby into the tote, concealed it with a bath towel, and they pushed their way through the clutch of murmuring neighbors who had gathered outside. He, in the interim, had called the doctor friend at a hospital where he had privileges. His friend was waiting at the emergency room door, and they handed the baby over. 2 weeks later, the mother of the child came in for her postpartum checkup. She shyly said, by way of explaining her infidelity, "I was lonely. My husband was gone for such a long time. I met a Turk with curly black hair. He treated me nice. He brought me flowers. I let him have his way with me." Dr. Olchek ended the story with, "And you know, that baby looked like a Turk."
Hi, my name is Sharon Cesario, and I've been part of this group for quite a few years. I went to it after my son Patrick had died for a matter of support and camaraderie, which I found really comes out. Mitch Levenberg is like a band leader to a band of all of us. We're all writers of different venues, some of us fiction, some of us nonfiction, some of us biographical. but he makes us all become like a symphony of song. Everybody brings in a different lyric, but they all come out with a musical piece. So that's what I felt from the class. Now, what I wrote about was a precinct where I started back in 1973. I found that it gave me some peace to go back to where I started back in 1973. So I wanted to write about the people that I worked with. You can go home again. I have wanted to write about a group of people who have helped me see that I was never really alone. That the saying, "you can never go home again," was just that, a saying, words on paper. When I returned back to where my career started with the New York City Police Department in 1973, to the 68th Precinct on May 6, 2014, expecting to find hostility and impatience with this older but wiser person, me. Instead, I found love, respect, and support. Also, a lot of admiration and patience as they listened to the stories of my colorful career. Well, as these people who I have met, they became like a family of sorts. We all have our quirks, and some of us have personal quandaries. How we get through it all is with holding each other's hand, lending an ear, and giving input when needed. What a strange bunch are we all. Different ages, experiences, and lifestyles. Yet not one of us will ever look at the other as less than. Because in this world where one-upmanship becomes an everyday occurrence, it is because we are who we are that the feeling is one of supportive strength, which we all draw from each day that we work together. Because in my over 41 years with the police department, I have noticed that without it, you only have chaos and stress. So I wrote this to honor those who have helped me learn that I am who I am and will always to my own self be true. Thank you for thinking that I have some knowledge and that I have a big heart. People have spoken of it, but you all have shown me that what has been said might be true. For this I am grateful and can tell you from my life experiences that working with all of you has been a heaven-sent gift. As my sons Patrick and Frankie always loved the 68th Precinct and the people who work there. So my legacy of love that I leave on this earth will be enhanced by my return home to where I started. Thanks for the memories that have been made and shared, also for the ones yet to be. Then I also wrote a small poem on the bus going to class, which Mitch always says seems to be the best thing I do, is write on the bus going to class. To be. The question has always been to be or not to be. Well, if any of us ever had the answer, we would see that the answer is not in the question, but in the suggestion. It sounds reflectively dismal and foreboding, yet if you think about it, maybe you would be beholding the answer to a question that has stunned many a mind. After all, we have only just begun.
My name is Kira Aronson. I've attended Mitch's class for several years and gotten a lot of inspiration and knowledge from him and from my fellow writers. I'm reading a section from my memoirs about my childhood during World War II. We escaped from Estonia in 1944, a day before the Russian army invaded my home country. We were occupied by the Germans at the time, who did not allow us to go anywhere else but Germany. But everybody remembered the previous Soviet occupation in 1940, when a lot of people, thousands, were arrested, executed, and sent to Siberia. The title of my story is Leaving Home. We were standing on board the German ship, waiting for it to leave. The Russians were bombarding the city. We could see fires and smoke everywhere and heard the Russian planes overhead. What was holding back the ship? Why did it just sit there? My parents had been arguing for days over when to leave. My father was sure that the Russians would be driven back, but a lot of people were leaving. Everyone was afraid of the Russians. Finally, we were herded into a large cabin assigned to women and children. There was not much light, nor were there any beds or seats. My mother found space in a corner and prepared makeshift beds for my brother and me on our suitcases. She herself spread a jacket on the floor and sat down, leaning against the bulkhead. There was no ventilation in the cabin, and the room was unbearably hot. The muffled rumble of the engines lulled us into slumber as the ship continued its slow voyage toward Germany and an unknown, uncertain future. My father was going to follow on another ship since he had to close up our home. Early next morning, my mother got up to go to the bathroom. "Stay right here and keep your life preservers on," she ordered. "After I come back, I will take you to the bathroom." Suddenly, there was a piercing shriek of an alarm. "Where is Mama?" my brother whispered, his blue eyes round with fear. Before I could reply, I saw her running toward us, shouting, "It's just a warning. Don't worry, children." At the next moment, an ear-shattering explosion rocked us with a blinding flash of fire and black smoke. I remember that much, then blackness, nothing. Regaining my consciousness, I found myself alone. I cried out, "Mama, Mama," but my mother was nowhere in sight. There was total darkness and smoke, with cries and moans surrounding me, along with the ominous sea water rushing into the cabin through a gigantic hole in the ship's side. Finally, I saw my mother arrive, carrying my brother. She had found him pinned down under a steel pole, crying. She grasped my hand as we moved slowly through the rising water toward the source of light coming from the upper deck. A rope ladder had been lowered down, and people were climbing up, those who were able. Others who were wounded drowned in the frigid water that was filling the cabin. As we were climbing up the ladder, I saw a woman's disembodied leg, clad in high-heeled shoes, float by. Horrified, I closed my eyes and put it out of my mind. When we reached the upper deck, there was chaos. A lot of people had jumped in the water by the ship and were thrashing in the cold, choppy waves. Some crew members were throwing life preservers to them, but they were not enough for everyone. My mother found a German soldier's fur-collared coat and wrapped it around us to keep us warm in the howling wind. We learned later that the ship had been struck by a torpedo, which made a huge hole in the side. Miraculously, the walls of the ship were sturdily built, so the water was contained in one cabin and the ship did not sink. After a few hours, the wounded were taken to see the ship's doctor. My mother's left eye had disappeared into a huge purple swelling and was encrusted with dried blood. The doctor said it was embedded with small glass fragments and feared that she may lose her eyesight. He was unable to remove the glass and said she needed to be treated at a hospital. When we reached our destination, I had small cuts on my face and back caused by flying shrapnel. My little brother was unable to walk because the metal pole had injured his back. Our luggage was lost, towed away by waves. All we had were the clothes we were wearing. My mother had lost one of her shoes, but someone lent her a pair of large men's shoes. She walked around the deck like Charlie Chaplin's tramp. When we finally arrived at our destination, we were taken to a hospital where we mended for 2 weeks. It took much longer for my brother to be able to walk again. We had lost our home and all our belongings and felt naked like newborn babes. It was a novel experience to have nothing. I think my mother suffered this loss more than I. All I felt at the time was a terrible fear of explosions and the loss of security and safety. Life ceased being comfortable or predictable. My only security was now my mother, to whom I clung with all my might in the days to come. Thank you.
Really enjoying everybody's presentations. And a special note, I remember going to Dr. Alchek in law school, and I just thank you for bringing that back, because you did such a wonderful job in bringing him back to life, and I really enjoyed that. We are honored that once again our council member Steve Levin is joining us. He is responsible for getting the grants from the City Council to fund this program, which we really appreciate Steve doing. Steve represents Brooklyn Heights, Dumbo, Greenpoint, Borum Hill, Vinegar Hill, downtown Brooklyn, and Bed-Stuy. He's the chair of the Committee of General Welfare. He's also on the committees of Cultural Affairs. He's on Environmental Protection, Education, Land Use, the Transportation Committee, and the Subcommittee on Landmarks, Public Sightings, and Maritime Uses, which must be the longest named subcommittee there is. But realizing how busy you are and how many committees you sit on and what a busy day you're having today, it really means a lot to us that you take some time out to come and say hello. So without further ado, Councilmember Steve Levin.
Well, hi, everybody, and thank you, Linda. That was a very nice introduction. And I want to thank Professor Levenberg for inviting me once again this year. I'm not going to speak very long because I actually want to hear your stories, and in the time that I have here, I want to hear as much as possible. But this is a real, for me, a real treasure to be able to contribute to this program and make sure that your stories are told, and that they're told in such vivid detail and color and emotion. It's very important, and I'm glad to be able to play a part in that. And thank you for committing part of yourself to paper, and all that goes along with that, the vulnerability and the emotion and the kind of difficult process that can entail. But it's very important for all of us, and for all the rest of us to hear your stories from you. So with that, I'll look forward to listening. Thanks.
I am Peter Pane, and I think I've been in this class, I think, for 2 years, and thanks to Mitch's encouragement, I've extended my memoir, which was just going to be committed to my experience of World War II. I'm now back to 1926, but I'm not starting yet, just don't worry. But anyway, this is called Hit the Deck. The action implied by that is due to an incident that happened almost 70 years ago. During the final battle of World War II, fought at Okinawa from April 1st through mid-August of 1945, the greatest threat to American warships participating in that struggle came from Japanese suicide kamikaze planes, whose repeated attacks often resulted in heavy casualties and loss of life, some of which personally witnessed by those of us nearby. Among the many warships engaged in the action at Okinawa was one of the Navy's oldest battleships, USS New York, BB-34. Once ranked as the Queen of the Fleet during World War I, The 35-year-old veteran was now known and referred to by her crew as the Old Lady, a term often tinged with some affection and respect. On April 15, 1945, 3 days after receiving the disheartening news of the death of our president, our commander-in-chief, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Old Lady was engaged firing salvos at Japanese positions on that island, when suddenly the ship's bugler sounded the very familiar and the least favorite bugle call of all bugle calls in his repertoire. It was the fanfare-like air raid warning call, and it signaled another threat. Bogies, the term for unidentified aircraft detected by radar, were again approaching our area. Here we go again, we thought. Let's hope they don't find us. The ship began the usual zigzagging maneuver in an attempt to make itself a more difficult target. But suddenly, the PA system clicked on, and a voice from the bridge, sounding terse and more compelling than usual, rang out with the order. Now hear this, all hands seek cover. Repeat, all hands seek cover. Needless to say, the repeat part was unnecessary. Hearing for the first time the seek cover command could only mean one thing. The moment we had all feared had arrived. So each in our own fashion sought cover. All hands, and especially feet, dashed in as many directions as best we could. The bogey, a suicide plane, had targeted our ship, the USS New York, and was in a headlong dive toward it. I began my own headlong dive toward the deck, but to my surprise and chagrin, getting there didn't go according to plan, and under vastly different circumstances, my dive would have been a scene reminiscent of the Three Stooges comedy routine. During my hasty lunge toward the deck, I neglected to free myself from the headphones attached to my head and a microphone which was securely strapped to my chest. At the other end, there were rubber cables and wires about 6 feet in length were firmly attached to a receptacle on the bulkhead. That's the wall, Navy talk. My dive for cover, heading in the opposite direction of that receptacle, exceeded the length of those cables. Consequently, in mid-dive, I was stopped abruptly with a rubbery jolt like a boing and yanked back in the opposite direction, landing on my rear end while still strapped to all that gear. Definitely not a cool way to hit the deck, I thought, and I hoped no one had seen just how it happened. I lay there wondering what to expect next. An explosion, a fire. Miraculously, none of these occurred, and I was alive and not really hurt. However, something had happened because I saw that men were running forward, looking, shouting, and pointing to something as they ran. We had been hit, but here again, the old lady's luck prevailed. The kamikaze, in its dive at our ship, missed hitting anything solid and fixed, like a gun turret or a mast or even the deck. Instead, in a glancing blow, it struck one of the 3 spotter seaplanes carried aboard the ship, hitting it where it sat on a catapult rail located some distance up and above the main deck. After colliding with that seaplane, part of the wing of the kamikaze fell harmlessly to the deck below. Its fuselage, however, continued in a downward plunge, but its trajectory sent it diagonally toward the outer railing of the main deck, which it cleared, thereby plunging into the sea. With it went its unexploded bombs and gasoline, thus sparing us what could have been a fiery and deadly explosion. What followed was a scene both incredible and somewhat comical. Having just dodged a bullet, actually a bomb in this case, the desire to obtain a souvenir of the event asserted itself. there was that wing of the attacking plane lying out on the main deck where it had fallen. I soon realized that the running, the pointing, the shouting going on was caused by my fearless and slightly insane shipmates outracing one another to get a piece of the fallen kamikaze wing. In minutes, the souvenir seekers, now including myself, had managed to strip off piece by piece most of the aluminum metal that had been part of that wing. We all got a piece of the action. Mine consists of 2 small shreds of aluminum metal stashed away with my other World War II memorabilia. After the war, in what was to be her final service, the New York old lady took part in Operation Crossroads, the atom bomb test conducted in 1946 by the U.S. Navy at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. Even there, the atom bombs that were dropped did not sink her, but she had become radioactive. And in 1948, much to the sorrow of those who had served aboard her, the old lady, she who had brought us home from that deadly dance, was towed out to sea where, after an 8-hour pounding by ships and planes using their newest weapons, she was finally gone, but not forgotten, especially by those who had trod her decks.
Good afternoon. My name is Kathleen Harvey, and I'm a new member of the writing group. This is my 2nd year, but it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience. The title of my paper is The Sunday Visitor. The church volunteer was late that Sunday morning, and John was restless. It was after 11 a.m., and he was already yearning to nap, as he had slept little the night before. He had always lived life on his terms, and he refused to go to bed until the visitor had come and gone. He would remain slumped in the upholstered chair, surrounded by the Sunday papers, his eyes half closed with sleep. The chair, placed in front of the wide windows, provided natural light, but the sky was cloudy from an overnight storm, and shadows filled the corners of the room. The parish church is around the corner, but John has been unable to attend for a few years, as he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. The 100-year-old building is a stunning example of Romanesque architecture, but the steep stairs are unforgiving to anyone with an unstable gait. The building offers no ramps or elevators, so even though John is not housebound, he cannot navigate the stairs. But in the 88th year of life, he still covets the connections of his youth. And the church visitor is always a welcome highlight on Sunday morning. His boyhood was spent in the West Village of New York City, a neighborhood teeming with immigrants at the start of the century. And there, the local church provided the glue for the newly arrived families. When World War II came in December 1941, it changed all Americans' lives. 13 million men served in the armed forces. John was the right age, so according to him, Uncle Sam gave him an all-expense tour of the world as he served as a sailor. When he returned home at the war's end, he stashed his medals in a box and joined the New York City Police Department. He wore the badge of the police department for over 30 years and had the swagger and booming voice that matched his 6-foot frame. He loved being a part of that 30-plus strong brotherhood. Even dressed in civilian clothes, cops of that era wore a uniform that was forever identifiable. It was a London fog trench coat, black shoes, never brown, dark trousers, a polyester white shirt draped by a narrow necktie. Except for a few mavericks, one would swear all cops had the same barber. They socialized together and went to family weddings and funerals. And when John's wife died, they surrounded him at her funeral. On September 11th, 2001, John was over 80 and had been retired for over 20 years. Like all New Yorkers, he watched the smoke billowing in the sky for weeks. But he stayed close to his telephone. Surely the precinct captain would call him back to active duty. The call never came. At last, the doorbell rang. It was 11:50, and John's thin, reedy voice gained volume as he greeted the church volunteer. The volunteer and John had an easy rapport, as he had visited for several years now. The regular format was followed. The gospel of the day was read, prayers were recited, John received communion, and then they gossiped about neighborhood news and baseball and all sports. The exchange was ever so brief, but for an instant, or for a moment, this lonely man's 6-foot frame was straight backed, and he was no longer the shrunken, frail person who needed help to lift help out of the chair. It only lasted 11 minutes, this visit, and when the door closed behind the volunteer, John gave his attention to the Sunday papers, and the shadows in the room appeared to have been filled with sunlight. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the nudging and the support, and it was nothing. Aaron's Leather Store. Several months ago, November 13th, a Thursday, at about midday, after a 2-hour meeting with a CPA, I felt I needed to clear my head. When I stepped out of the elevator and reached the street level, I started heading to the West 28th Street subway station at 7th Avenue in Manhattan. Suddenly, I spotted a run-down little leather store directly across the street. As I approached it, it drew me in and piqued my curiosity. I wanted to have a closer look. Because it was drizzling at the time, I decided to get out of the rain and step into the store to satisfy my curiosity. Only later did it become quite clear to me why it possessed me to step into the store. The shop appears to be in a time warp, somewhat out of sync with the surrounding other shops in the area, which consists of a miscellany of coffee shops, fitness club, Planet Fitness, and look-alike franchise stores. In the window of the leather store was a simple hand-lettered sign that read, Aaron Leather, open Monday through Thursday. Ring bell. It was signed Aaron. Near the entrance sat an old, thin man, Aaron, probably the author of the sign in the window. He sat at a large work table which contained papers, pieces of leather, and some tools for working leather. Aaron was wearing a canvas work apron, and I noticed it had two large black leather pockets. He was probing for something from one of the pockets, a pencil or perhaps a small tool. The store was fairly narrow but very deep, and lined with shelves on either side that held rolls and rolls of leather, a dizzying array of skins in assorted colors, patterns, textures, and finishes. Also hanging overhead were fur pieces, fox, coyote, sheepskin pieces used for such things as hats, coat collars, belts, handbags. Because I was the only customer and I said just browsing, I struck up a conversation with him. And as I spotted a copy of The Forward, a Yiddish language newspaper, I took a chance and started talking to him in Yiddish, something I don't get a chance to do very often. At that, he opened up and started telling me about the leather business in New York, that it is a vanishing trade, that it has been in a downtrend since the 80s, when it began migrating offshore, mostly to China. Shoe manufacturing and tanning, the major parts of the leather industry, he said, was particularly hard hit in Massachusetts, which could no longer compete with China. When I asked him how long he worked in leather, he said, all my life. My grandfather and my great-grandfather was in leather back in Poland. Now, several weeks before I bumped into this little leather store, I attended the funeral of Annie Adler, a 92-year-old distant cousin. She and her husband, Oscar Adler, both Holocaust survivors, happened to be in the leather business also. It occurred to me that Aaron here probably knew my cousins, the Adlers. Most probably Oscar, who was quite prominent in the leather trade in New York. And sure enough, he did. He knew that Oscar was no longer living. However, the news about Annie's recent death visibly saddened him, and he became quiet and a little gloomy, perhaps even thinking about his own mortality. Although Annie was a very important part of their business, she kept a low profile. Oscar was the public image of the business. He was Mr. Outside to hers Mrs. Inside. Together, they ran a successful business for many years. Aaron spotted the leather envelope I was carrying and asked me about it. He admired it and took it in his hand to examine it more closely. As he did this, his manner became more animated and lively. After all, he was once again in his element. He was handling a piece of leather. And right away he asked me all the relevant questions. Was the skin genuine ostrich? Where did you get it? He said. I told him I made it myself. He complimented me on the workmanship. He continued probing, asking me, how long did it take you to make it? Did you make it in a single sitting? And do you still work leather? No, I said, I had not done any leather in over 30 years. Before leaving, we shook hands. Call me Osher, he said, that's his Yiddish name, and gave me his business card. I left with the impression of being in the presence of a real throwback, a genuine old world craftsman, sadly one of a vanishing breed.
My name is Julia Pani, and while my husband writes memoirs, I've fallen into a niche of writing short mysteries. Unfortunately, they're all too long to bring, so I've brought a short vignette. This is a short story of fiction, but it grew out of an encounter with a little boy who, with a very long word, during my years of teaching children. Alan Martin Jackson goes to school. Alan Martin Jackson was a very smart little boy. His mother always told him so, and he believed her. His father always greeted him, "How's my little man?" which made him feel particularly proud and grown up. At an early age, his mother introduced him to his favorite book called Chrysanthemum, about a little girl with a very unusual name. The book was such a favorite that by the time he was 2.5, he had picked out all the letters for Chrysanthemum's name from a box of letters that his mother had given him on his first Christmas, because she expected great things from her smart little boy. His mother was so proud of his accomplishment that he was often awakened at night to come down and spell chrysanthemum for their guests. Alan Martin Jackson's name was also special. In fact, he had 3 names that included all of his grandparents, so none of them would feel left out. Alan was his grandmother's new name when she stopped living with Grandpa Martin, and Jackson was for his father's parents, who still lived in the house where his father had lived before he married Alan Martin's mother. Their house was filled with pictures of his father when he was a little boy, and Grandpa Jackson always told Alan Martin that he was a spittin' image of his father. Alan Martin wasn't too sure what Grandpa meant, because he hadn't seen any pictures of his father spitting, and anyhow his mother said spitting wasn't nice. Alan Martin, as he was called at home, lived in a very democratic house. Both his parents always asked his opinion about everything, even though he was sometimes outvoted on a few things like the hour of his bedtime. All in all, life was pretty wonderful at the Jackson house until Alan Martin was halfway to his 4th birthday. His beautiful mother sat him down beside her one day and explained very carefully that with the new house and a new car, the family would need more money. And although she had not worked since Alan Martin was born, she would have to go back to work. She said that she was sad about it, but there was no choice. Alan Martin wasn't too sure what going back to work meant, but if his mother was sad, he would be too. When the day came, he really felt very sad, indeed, because he had learned that his mother would not be leaving him with Grandma Allen or Grandma Jackson. She was taking him to some place called a nursery school, where she explained there would be lots of children for him to play with. Alan Martin had not played with many children, and he was pretty sure that he didn't want to start now. However, this was one of the times that his vote was overruled, and early one Monday morning, Alan Martin and his mother set off for his first day of nursery school. It was not a particularly happy morning for him. His mother left him with a kiss and a hug and told him that she would return sometime after he had a nap. Alan Martin didn't feel at all sleepy, and no one suggested that he start his nap right away. Instead, the teacher took him to a group of children where another teacher was going to read a story. Alan Martin told the teacher that he would like for her to read Chrysanthemum, but the teacher didn't ask his opinion at all. She chose a different story. She didn't ask him to sit by her, so he couldn't see the words very well, and she showed the pictures so fast that Alan Martin didn't get to name all the animals in the pictures. This way of reading did not please Alan Martin at all. After the story, The teacher asked the children what things they would like to play with. All the children seemed to know what to choose. Alan Martin finally saw a box of letters, and he spelled chrysanthemum. Nobody came to look at what he had done except one teacher who said, "That's a mighty big word for such a little boy." No one had ever called Alan Martin such a little boy, so he put the letters away. The teacher rang a bell. It was time for art. Children were using clay and finger paint and other gooey stuff. "Alan," the teacher said. "My name is Alan Martin," he replied. "Well, Alan Martin, which table would you like to join?" "I don't like gooey stuff," Alan Martin said. "I want to read chrysanthemum." "It's time for art now," the teacher said, "and these are the art choices." "Can't I just draw?" Alan Martin asked, feeling the tears behind his eyes, but Mommy always said to use your words and not your tears, so Alan Martin blinked his eyes and waited. "Don't you want to sit with the other children?" the teacher asked. Alan Martin looked at the other children who were enthusiastically spreading the paints and pounding the clay, and he says, "No, I'll just sit over here." He drew a picture of his mommy, his daddy, and all of his grandparents because he missed them very much. A few tears escaped onto the paper, but no one saw them. And when they went outside to the playground, some children ran around chasing each other and climbing the slide one right after the other. And some children were on tricycles, and there were never so many children when Alan Martin and his mommy went to the park. His mommy always pushed him in the swings or stood at the foot of the slide when he came down. The teachers asked a little boy named Jimmy to show him the tricycles, but when Alan Martin looked at all the tricycles, it looked too busy. So Alan Martin remembered his manners and said, "No, thank you." And he stood with the teachers until the children had to line up to go back inside. The children were told to go to the bathroom and to wash their hands. Alan Martin didn't feel like he needed to go to the bathroom, but Mommy sometimes said, "Just try," so he did. After a while, lunch came. No one had asked Alan Martin what he wanted to eat, and he didn't like what he saw, but everyone else was eating. So he remembered his mommy again and just tried a few bites. After lunch was nap. Everyone had a cot and a sheet and a blanket. Mommy had brought his favorite blanket, which made Alan Martin feel a little better. But no one came to read him a story. His mommy always read him a story when he took his nap. A few tears rolled down his cheeks. Nobody had said that he was a smart boy even once all day. And nobody had asked him what he wanted or made him feel strong or proud at all. After nap, he began to look for his mommy. The teacher read another book, but it still wasn't chrysanthemum. While the teacher was reading, Alan Martin saw his mommy's face at the door. He jumped up, but the teacher said he would have to wait. At last, his mommy came in and signed a paper and took him by the hand. "How did you like your first day of school?" she asked. "Mommy," Alan Martin said in a very serious voice, "are you sure that you told them that I was coming today? Because nobody seemed to know who I am."
My name is Nancy Jones, and I would like to read an excerpt from an article that I wrote on Henry Kissinger. He's in his 90s, but nevertheless very active at the moment. He's been on television plugging his latest book. He's appeared on before Senate committees, expounding his foreign policy, and he was recently praised by Foreign Policy magazine as the best Secretary of State in 50 years, although his detractors continue to call him a war criminal. All of this publicity made me think of my article entitled My Dinner with Henry. I am reading Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci's infamous 1972 interview with Henry Kissinger, but I am thinking about my dinner with Henry in 1966. The salient thing in my mind about that dinner is that he was very late and my dinner was burnt. Many years earlier, I had an interesting job on the staff of Governor Nelson Rockefeller. He was making a bid against Richard Nixon for the Republican nomination for president, and he assembled a staff to run that campaign. Although I had no political affiliation then, nor did I ever think about politics, I was hired to write a research paper on the Middle East. I had just graduated from college, had spent the previous summer on a student study tour through the Middle East, and that was enough to get me hired. As things go in politics, I never did write that paper, but was instead assigned to Rockefeller's domestic policy group. I worked in a stately brownstone whose address I never forgot, 22 West 55th Street. At the time, Henry Kissinger was everyone's foreign policy advisor, including Rockefeller's, and occasionally I would catch sight of him either coming in or going out of the building. The person I did get to know quite well was his future wife, Nancy McGinnis. She worked in the same office with me and two other research staffers. Nancy and I had wonderful debates, and I became quite fond of her, but not fond of her very conservative political views. But they were responsible for my eventual interest in politics and history. In 1962, I left my job with Rockefeller and moved to Boston, closer to my home. Nancy kept in touch by sending some wonderful ex-boyfriends, none of whom worked out for me since they were still stuck on her. Before I left the position with Rockefeller, 6-foot Nancy had begun dating recently divorced Henry Kissinger and seemed totally enamored of this big man, short big man, who stood at half her height. Years later, when I returned to live in New York City with a husband and new baby, I called Nancy and invited her to dinner. "May I bring our hero?" she asked. "Who might that be?" I answered, having no clue. "Henry Kissinger," she replied. And I did not say, "No, you may not bring him." Instead, I decided to invite another woman from our former research group. She was also married, so it would be an intimate little dinner party of 6 people, including me and my husband. Since my sister was a very good cook, I asked her for an appropriate menu that wouldn't be too hard to execute. She sent an exotic recipe of meat and rice, which she assured me would be no trouble. For some reason, after I read the cooking instructions, I thought I should double the rice part just to ensure that there would be plenty for everyone. When the night of the big dinner party arrived and the clock struck 7, the agreed upon time, I got a call from the other couple, Ann and Ed, who were lost. They were trying to find my apartment in Dumbo, now fashionable, but then a deserted and slightly dangerous warehouse area. Giving them more accurate directions, they arrived at our apartment at 7:30. The phone rang again, and this time it was Nancy saying she and Henry would be a little late, that he was tied up in a meeting. As the clock moved on to 8, then 8:30, then 9 p.m., I received a final call from Nancy saying they were on their way. Around 9:30, I began cooking. I should have known that Henry and Nancy would also get lost, so they arrived much later than expected. The meat had already been pretty much overcooked, but I had not yet started the rice. When they were comfortably settled in their pre-dinner drinks, Evan, my 7-month-old baby, began to cry, so I went to his bedroom and carried him into the living room. Henry lit up. "Oh, give him to me," he said, and sat Evan on his lap. My dear little son, who was extremely shy, took one look at this stranger and let out a piercing scream, the likes of which petrified my guests and sent me scurrying over to rescue him from a shell-shocked Henry. I put Evan safely back in his crib, and when I returned to the living room, my husband Brian, who thought our guest was Leon Kaiserling, an economic and political pundit, was very busy denouncing the Vietnam War. Since Henry was an advisor not only to Rockefeller but to President Johnson, who upon taking office had escalated the war, he fell silent. I quickly introduced another topic to everyone's obvious relief. At 10 p.m., I could delay the dinner no longer and disappeared into my little kitchen to tackle the rice part of the recipe. I had double the portion called for, and now the rice was beginning to rise up and escape from the pan like the blob, a creature from the deep. At that point, while I was trying to catch the overflowing rice, Henry decided to pay the cook a little social visit. Perhaps husband Brian had introduced another taboo subject. Trying to disguise the disaster, I stood between Henry and the rice, mumbled some nicety, and escorted him back to the group. When dinner was finally served, burnt steak, dried rice, my husband, a former English war baby, who always ate whatever rations were placed before him, said, "Well, shall I start the parade for seconds?" No one moved. Henry, however, much to my relief, kept the conversation going with tales of his army experience. He obviously relished the story of how he won the Bronx Star. "I was supposed to find the Nazis in this little German town," he related, "and since I was the only one in my unit who spoke German, I was sent ahead to scout the town. I found the mayor and simply asked him in German who the Nazis were. He politely handed me a neat little list, which I brought back to my commanding officer. Not a shot was fired, and shortly after, I was awarded the Bronx Star." He told other very amusing stories to entertain us, and I had to admit to myself, maybe his popularity with all those movie stars was well deserved. The next day, Nancy called to thank me for dinner and offer me a job with her at the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation. I declined, citing the need to care for my son. A couple of weeks later, Henry sent me a beautiful bouquet of flowers with a note which read, "With belated thanks for a lovely dinner." When they were delivered, I was in Massachusetts for the week, so they were left with a doorman. When I collected the wilted, overcooked flowers, I thought, how very appropriate. Now, I just want to say, I am the last, and in class, I'm always the last. And I like to think that Mitch thinks of me as last but not least. Let's hope so.
I always promise my class that, every week I say I'm going to read something, and then I end up not reading. So I brought a little piece. I won't keep you long. It's something I wrote. It's kind of a tribute to my mother, and she was living in an independent living facility for a while. So this is. I came down to visit. I was in Florida. I came down to visit, and this is kind of my experience at happy hour. They had a happy hour there. So now I'm here visiting my mother, and we're sitting in the great room waiting for happy hour to begin. We're half an hour early, so we don't have to be happy yet, but I think we are anyway. When we enter the great room, Bing Crosby is playing on the radio, a large 1930s or 40s radio that reminds me of the Twilight Zone, where the man in the old age home desperately wants to go back to his youth, finds an old radio that looks like this one in the basement, which plays only 30s and 40s music, only the music of his youth, which only he can hear, which plays only for him. Now I feel, too, somehow, listening to this radio, listening to Bing Crosby, that I've been transported to another time, but not my time, their time, as if in some twisted, ironic dream. I have not become young again, but old, including, like the people, including my mother, who surround me. I look for a way out, but every exit, every means of escape is blocked by walkers and wheelchairs and outstretched, stiffened limbs, Limbs that once outstretched and stiffened like that take time to unstretch and unstiffen themselves again. People stare at me mostly out of curiosity, but some cannot take their eyes off me. Why? I feel caught by two worlds between past and future. The present is murky, uncertain. No, in this room now, in what seems like the present, is only past and future. These people, in a blink of an eye, really such a short time ago, were my age, and in just such a blink of an eye, and in just as short a time, I will be theirs. A young man, his head shaven, is setting up his equipment in the front of the room. He apparently is the singer. My mother is getting impatient. Why is he taking so long, she asks. She's anxious to start her happy hour, to be happy for an hour at least. Maybe there's something wrong, she says. There must be something wrong, she says, with her there must be something wrong expression, that expression of certainty and disgust. Relax, I tell her. It's not even happy hour, not for another 5 minutes. Oh, 5 minutes, she asks, as if she is humoring me. Oh, I see, she says. 5 minutes. Yes, it's that moment between happy and not happy in this room, this great room, where anything can happen, though really not anything that great. When the residents first arrive, there is a festive atmosphere, but then a certain restlessness sets in. Some people travel clear across the room to visit someone, quite a journey really, a real commitment. But the question always lingers, will they ever return again to the safe harbor from which they ventured? When one lady returns to her seat, which to her might be equivalent to Odysseus returning to Ithaca, she finds it occupied. I'm sitting in your seat, the lady sitting in her seat tells her. Yes, you are, the weary returned traveler agrees. Do you want it back, the usurper asks. Yes, I do, the returner shouts. There's a general shifting around, restless muttering going on. My mother keeps asking me if I want to sit down. Suddenly, another lady, her name is Yvette, appears with her walker and places herself in front of my mother. The refreshments arrive. There is that pleasant whirring sound of the blender in the distance of drinks being mixed. Another lady, as if appearing from nowhere, and perhaps she has, turns off Bing Crosby. I notice a man in a blue polo shirt, much like my own, completely bent over without meaning to be, and worried that I might look like that one day. Then a young girl starts walking around with a tray, handing out little pastries. When she comes up to me, I find myself trying to straighten up as much as possible, hoping she doesn't think I'm one of the residents. When she starts passing around the drinks, I take one. It's much too sweet. I believe there's supposed to be some vodka in it, mixed with some tropical fruit juice. But again, who knows? I tell my mother, since she's on medication, as is most everyone else I assume, not to drink too much of it. Then she asks again if I'd like to sit down. No, I tell her, I'm fine. Finally, the singer seems ready to go. The lady sitting in front and to the side of my mother asks if she's in her way, but my mother says no. Then, while the singer is introducing himself to the audience, my mother introduces me to Yvette. This is my son, she says with great pride. She seems to feel very secure at the moment. She has past, present, and future locked up, at least for the moment. Her son is with her now. The singer, young and fresh-looking, begins with, I've got the world on a string. Since I've been here, I've thought of people hanging by a string, but not necessarily holding the world by it. As he sings, he walks among the crowd, smiling and shaking hands. Once, one of these women grabs his hand. They're reluctant to let go. Yvette turns around again to ask my mother if she's in her way. My mother again tells her no. Then, as if this reminds her I'm still standing, my mother tells me this time to sit. Again, I tell her I'm fine. In fact, I like standing. Then I look at Yvette. She is clapping her hands to the music. Even my mother begins to snap her fingers, and I find myself videotaping her doing it, just focusing in on her fingers, because all her energy, all her life, all she is or ever wanted to be seems to be contained within those snapping fingers. Suddenly I find myself moving my head up and down to the music, and I become frightened. I am in the moment. I am actually enjoying this. For that moment, I am no longer separate from what is going on in that room, but a part of it. In fact, I might as well be sitting down or else doing what looks like the frug with Esther, one of the women up front, who has abandoned her walker and started dancing. Yvette turns to us and smiles. She can really dance, my mother says to her. Yes, Yvette says. Am I in your way? No, my mother reassures her. Then I begin to wonder, as witchcraft blasts through the room, whether Yvette might really be in my mother's way. But no, it can't be. Not unless the singer stood immobile the whole show in the left-hand corner of the stage. The girl comes around again with drinks. One woman says to her, "I've had 2, I think that's enough." Suddenly my mother starts to get up, and about halfway up she says to me, "You must be tired, sit." I tell her I'm fine and gently push her down again. At last the singer introduces his last song, My Way, and the audience groans in disappointment that he will be leaving soon, that happy hour will end, and then somewhere along the highways or byways of one's life, Yvette suddenly gets up and begins to move towards the back of the room. Passing my mother, she says, as if she has made some final irrevocable decision, "I know I was in your way." And my mother, still smiling, says quite emphatically, "No, you weren't in my way at all." But Yvette, absolutely certain in her conviction that she was, and has been the whole time, begins to move even more slowly towards the back. I look at her face, and she seems calmer now, a little more certain perhaps. Not that she hasn't been, but that she is no longer in the way. Not just my mother's way, but perhaps like so many of these people here, in anyone's way. I smile at Yvette on her way out. She has a name, a beautiful name, the same name she had as a young girl, and as a woman, and as an artist, and now as an old woman. I remember meeting her only hours earlier, and I think how much more her face and eyes can tell me now than her words can. "Sorry if I was in your way," she says to us one more time on her way out. My mother smiles. Even my mother recognizes she has said this one too many times. "No problem," I tell Yvette, as if perhaps she was in my way after all. Perhaps it makes her feel good. Not necessarily that she was in our way, because she is still able to get out of our way, and thus can still make a difference in people's lives. Then, before we even leave the great room, someone has put Bing Crosby back on the radio. Or have they, I wonder, as I step with uncertainty out of one hour and into the next. Thank you.